Hello, I'm LegenTerry and this is Diablo IV, the hellish isometric ARPG from Activision Blizzard. But you probably already knew that because, yeah, it's been out for a while. That's alright. So this video is basically going to be split into two parts. The first will be my thoughts on the campaign and the experience gained from level 1 to 50, and the standard stuff you would expect in a review. The second part will go over my time spent in the post-game grind to 100, and all the additional objectives that entails. There is a reason this video took so long to put together. With that out of the way, let me open by saying that Diablo IV is a pretty great game. Mostly. Diablo has been around for a very long time and gone through its fair share of ups and downs. As the fourth main installment, this game was set to be a big return to form for the art style, the gameplay, and the storytelling that many fans have felt disappointed with by recent entries, including a mobile game that contributed to the quickly sinking public trust in Activision Blizzard. Lucky for them, this game manages to set the new bar for what it means to be called a Diablo game. The story begins roughly 30 years after the events of Diablo III, with some random treasure hunters being tricked into summoning the antagonist of the game, Lilith, Daughter of Hatred. You, a lone wanderer in one of 5 classes, Barbarian, Necromancer, Sorcerer, Rogue, or Druid, find yourself subjected to a ritual that ties your fate to hers. You begin manifesting visions of her actions as you follow her trail through a winding narrative of religious and militaristic intrigue. It's going to take a lot of power, some intense legwork, and a touch of insight from the locals to unravel Lilith's devious plans for the future of Sanctuary. Diablo IV is beautiful to behold in its own wicked way. While Diablo 3's style upset a lot of fans by rounding off the hard edge of its predecessors, this game leans into the violence and horror that the world of Sanctuary was built on. It's a dark, twisted place full of atrocities, and it always has been. Not in a scary way for players necessarily, but with environments and enemy designs that aim to make you uncomfortable. Exploring the demon-infested underground ruins, the dens full of heretical cultists, or the great chasms filled with malformed body parts and blood will keep you on your toes and anxious about your next encounter. At least until you acclimate to the harder difficulties and turn your character into the unstoppable killing machine they were destined to become. The level of detail in the main character models has been significantly boosted from Diablo 3, allowing the devs to cut directly to them for in-game cinematics. Though sometimes it can be kind of funny to see your created character stand side by side with other people in generic getups when you have skulls and chains dangling from your plate mail with wildly colored eyes and hair. Everyone is voice acted, including your own character and all of the NPCs, at least for their most important lines of dialogue. Most of it is really solid work, but occasionally there's a lukewarm performance that sticks out. Like the side character guy that you've never met before in the first chapter, dying and overacting his heart out.
Evil itself mocks Sanctuary. Do this for me.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just me, but that tone is a little bit goofy. Your main traveling companions are a pretty likable lot, with a bunch of fun interactions between them that help flesh out their personalities. There was only one of them that I didn't really gel with. They got introduced in a weird way and didn't get a lot of screen time, and they also didn't seem to be too interested in playing nice with the rest of the cast. But I'm inching a little too close to spoiler territory, so let's move on. As a whole, I thought the story presented was great. The tone is extremely dark this time, the characters don't feel one-dimensional, and because of the structure, you get to see a lot of what the villains are up to while you make your way across Sanctuary. If I had to complain about one thing, it would be the lack of full cinematic cutscenes. Blizzard are notorious for producing these things, like they look as good as any Hollywood CGI does, but sadly, only 2 made the cut in Diablo IV. The first is the intro cinematic, which is basically just the trailer they showed off all the way back in 2019. The second one shows up in the final act and is extremely cool, which makes it all the more of a shame that there weren't a few more spread throughout the rest of the game. The soundtrack is composed from a harrowing blend of bleak orchestral pieces and creepy choirs chanting in Latin. You know, the standard affair for gothic horror. Most of the songs are tone-setting pieces for different environments, but I feel like they could have used some more standout tracks for the boss fights and impactful story moments. They reserved a few awesome songs for the world bosses, but those come in the post-game. I gotta say though, I do really like the theme for the Wandering Death fight. And if you like this video, maybe you could subscribe for more videos like it in the future? The real meat of the game is, of course, the loot and the combat. If you're familiar with the series, or isometric ARPGs in general, you probably already know how most of this works. The loot is scaled by color-coded rarity from white to orange, and you get it by smashing or casting your way through swaths of enemies. The loot is pretty standard for an RPG of Diablo's ilk. Lots of numbers and lots of different use cases on every item. Some buff your character with a wide net, like straight damage or critical chance percentages, and some are more narrowly focused, like crowd control duration increases or bonus points for a class-specific skill. Once you've cleared the main story, you get a mission to do a level 50 capstone dungeon. Beating this gives you access to World Tier 3, which has tougher enemies but rewards you with more high-quality loot and experience. Beyond the standard array of rarity colors, there are now also prefixes that can come applied to each one at World Tiers 3 and 4. World Tier 3 is where items with the Sacred prefix begin to drop, and at World Tier 4 you'll start to see Ancestral items. This made the gear chase feel less stagnant than it would have gotten otherwise because the stat rolls on Sacred and Ancestral items are always higher than their regular counterparts. Legendary items are their own beast, which I'll tackle further down the line, but I'm sort of disappointed in the way they work this time around. The real chase is actually in the unique items, which are technically a step above legendary items. These come with a predetermined set of stats and varying values, and an extremely unique affix. They're often build-defining pieces that boost the power of your character's skills substantially, and they are not easy to come by. I found one before finishing the main campaign, and got one for free by completing it, and it wasn't until the late 60s that I started finding them more often. At level 90, however, I've probably gotten 15 unique drops that are mostly duplicates. And yet, I'm still missing the Deathless Visage helmet that's meant to bump up my entire in-game's build effectiveness. That's super frustrating. I just want my bone spears to explode, man. Is that too much to ask? Anyways, besides uniques, there are a bunch of ways to modify your gear once you've got stuff that's nearly perfect. The easy ones are going to the blacksmith and the jeweler and having them upgrade your armor, weapons, and jewelry up to 5 times each. Then there's gems that you can apply to your gear, stats you can swap once for other random rolls, and legendary aspects. Let's open that can of worms. The reason I said I was disappointed with the way legendaries work earlier is because of the legendary affix system. Normal legendary items are still around and can still drop, but towards the later levels especially, they have been massively devalued. 99% of the legendary drops you find, you will not care about. They almost always drop with terrible stat mixes, and will have an affix that probably doesn't mesh with any of the stats on said item. Instead, the only thing you'll be looking at is the singular legendary affix at the bottom of the item's description. You can take a legendary item to the occultist and have them destroy it to strip the affix off, and then you can take that affix and apply it to a new item of lower rarity. Basically, you can take any piece of yellow rarity gear and turn it into a legendary item with the affix you actually want. This system sounds good on paper, but in practice, it just kinda makes getting legendary items boring. You see the orange and hear that familiar bell chime, and rather than thinking, whoa, I bet that thing is cool, the Pavlovian response becomes, great. I wonder if it has the one aspect I'm looking for and a high roll. Because there are like 225 of these things, and playing a specific class only narrows that down to about 60. You can also get these legendary affixes in a different way that's guaranteed, but don't get too excited. Almost every dungeon on the map will reward you with one of them, which goes into your codex to be used at any time. The only problem is that applying the affix from your codex rather than a legendary drop only gives you the bare minimum stat roll. You are actively making your own item worse than it could be by using these, and there's no way to reverse it. Why didn't they at least make this a randomized roll to make it slightly more exciting and rewarding? Am I crazy? Anyways, I guess I've aired my grievances with high-end loot enough, so let's talk character progression. Each time you level up, you get a point to put into your character's skill tree, which is segmented by different types of skills. Classes get access to a node full of basic skills that generate or refill a class-specific resource, and a node of core skills that expend that resource. Once you choose a skill to add to your tree, you can spend more points to further specialize and modify it with additional effects or improved damage, or bypass upgrading it completely to work your way further down the tree. Classes generally work best when you pick one thing to excel at, like doing massive bursts of damage and getting out quickly, or creating large area of effect fields. As for me, I went with a Necromancer, because I wanted to make some new friends. Their whole deal is managing a group of skeletal minions that fight enemies for them. I chose the basic skill Decompose, which is a channeled attack that creates a corpse every couple of seconds. Then I chose the core skill Blight, which launches an AoE projectile that covers the ground. I then grabbed another skill called Corpse Explosion, which does exactly what it sounds like to the corpses created by Decompose, but I modified it to also leave behind a damaging miasma pool when they blow up. I chose to use Reaper Skeletons that create corpses from enemies they attack on occasion, further feeding into my Deadpool build. It's definitely not the most effective or flashy build, but it got the job done and it was fun to put together. Thankfully, the devs have since fixed the visual effects on the corpse explosion miasma, so it no longer overlaps itself and makes navigating the battlefield impossible for your party. At the very low and very high ends of the content difficulty scale, classes are a little lopsided as far as balance goes, but of course they'll eventually try and level out most of them with patches. Right now, they're still trying to squash the weird bugs and unintended damage interactions, with players constantly finding new ways to make broken builds in both the subjective and literal senses. I do feel really bad for my sorcerer brethren though, because their main stat intelligence is not giving the correct damage resistance it should be. This has put sorcerers in the endgame further on the glass side of the glass cannon spectrum than intended. The devs have said that a fix for intelligence will have to come in a seasonal update later down the road. I might be alone here, but I feel like maybe getting an entire main stat point working the way it's meant to should be prioritized over most other things. Druids, barbarians, and rogues all seem to be loved relatively equally by the community, though the rogue playstyle looks to be much more frantic than the others. Druids are ultra tanks in the late levels, and barbarians, well, barbarians have evolved into Beyblades. I think I lucked out choosing a necromancer for my first class though. There are quite a few good ways to build them, and they don't lose much viability in the higher levels. The skeleton minions could definitely stand to get buffed in both damage and survivability, and having to use up an entire extra button slot to summon or heal them and use a corpse golem at the same time is really awful. Hopefully they adjust that and smooth out the experience, but I'm not going to hold my breath until they speak on the topic themselves. Unlike Diablo III, the main map in Diablo IV is static and not randomly generated. All of the towns, the places where dungeons and cellars are, the enemy spawn locations, and the side quest NPCs remain stationary. The dungeons themselves, however, are randomly generated, so that running them multiple times over doesn't get too familiar. This also means that Blizzard is able to keep players within the same server shard on the overworld map, giving you the ability to cooperate with other players in events that occasionally show up. Jumping into these will give you a small chest full of loot and a handful of obols, which can be given to a vendor for categorized items of your choosing. Getting to interact with other players at this level is kind of cool, but it also means that to many people's dismay, this is an always online game. I think many people would forgo these MMO-like features if it meant being able to play without an internet connection. But for now, we should probably talk about how you're going to spend most of your time getting loot. In the campaign, you have your main quest, which takes you across most of the overworld map. While you run around, you'll frequently see icons pop up on your minimap. The largest explorable locations you'll find are dungeons, which are sprawling, labyrinthian areas filled with enemies. You'll be given a set of objectives to complete, like freeing prisoners or collecting keys to open a door, and then fight a boss at the end. I already mentioned that they reward legendary affixes for your codex, but they're also one of the fastest ways to get loot drops in general. There are also cellars, which are like a mini dungeon consisting of a single room, a handful of enemies, and a fight with an elite enemy or a group of elite enemies. I do not know why these exist. They aren't rewarding at all, and they don't even count towards any progress on your regional renown track. Regional renown is basically a second form of character progression. Each region has its own experience bar that you earn rewards on by completing side objectives. Clearing the fog of war on the map, finding fast travel waypoints and altars of Lilith, doing dungeons, strongholds, and side quests all contribute to your renown. Reaching milestones on the track rewards you with additional healing potions, more space for murmuring obol coins, massive chunks of experience, and eventually a handful of paragon points. We'll talk about those in a bit. I really like this system. It makes doing all, or at least most of the extra stuff that the game has to offer worthwhile. I'm pretty sure after one of the latest updates, your progress even carries over to your new characters on the Eternal Realm, so they also get the benefits. But only for the Eternal Realm, not completely for the Seasonal Realm. Yeah, that's probably a topic for another day in another video, so let's just keep going. I think it's finally time to talk about the endgame. The Grim Favors, Helltides, Legion events, and world bosses are pretty cool, but most of them don't really give you a lot of loot for your time. They all also operate on timers, meaning that you won't always have access to them. You'll spend a lot of time just waiting for them to appear or waiting for the timer to run out on one that's too far along to join. You'll probably spend most of your time with Nightmare Dungeons, the only activity that's actually difficult and doesn't require you watching the clock. These are just souped up versions of standard dungeons with modifiers and higher level enemies, and they now give the most experience points and loot drops along with the ability to upgrade your Paragon board glyphs. If you have a high tolerance for repetitive content, you won't have a big problem with them. but when you're slogging your way through the high 70s and 80s, you will absolutely feel the grind of these weighing you down. It's kind of weird that they didn't utilize the overworld more, with things like strongholds being a one-time deal and cellars being nearly pointless. I wish there were a few more permanent in-game activities. Also, none of the story missions are repeatable at all, which seems like an oversight, especially when that was Diablo 3's entire in-game for a while. I mentioned Paragon boards back there, so let's cover those real quick. Paragon boards are unlocked after level 50, where you can really dig into character specialization. Each class has a few types of boards that can be interlinked and rotated around, giving you a pathway through a set of multiple nodes to fill out. Most of them are very minor upgrades, like +5 to a single stat, but then you reach rare nodes, legendary nodes, and glyph slots that give you extreme boosts in power. The key to placing your Paragon points is planning out the most effective route to get what you need. These points were infinite in Diablo 3, but here you're bound by a number cap once you reach level 100 and you have all the regional renown objectives finished. If you just go all in and collect every normal node in the first board, you will not have anything left to spend on your 4th or 5th board. This is a really cool and powerful system, but man, does it look like a mess to anyone that hasn't played the game. And I don't blame them for thinking that. There is not a sane individual on this planet who can commit this to memory. It's made worse by the fact that unlike normal skill levels, you can't refund them all at once to try something new. You have to slowly work your way backwards and manually scrub the board clean node by node. I've heard rumors that they may be working on a loadout system that could alleviate some of these problems, but that's neither here nor there. For the time being, it is what it is, and we all have to deal with it. Oh yeah, and there's also PvP in the game. It, exists. So here's the thing, the Fields of Hatred really aren't that intuitive. Either it's a barren wasteland where everyone ignores each other so they can grab their own loot and get out, or there's a max level player hanging out in there griefing anyone who tries. The whole point is to hoard piles of a resource called Seeds of Hatred from killing standard PvE enemies, and then extract them at altars marked on the map. Once you begin the minute-long extraction process, everyone in the zone gets notified, and you have to defend yourself against anyone who shows up. The loot comes pretty fast, and there's a few exclusive cosmetics from it, but it's completely optional. The last thing I'll bring up, and only briefly, is the monetization and microtransaction store. For the most part, they've kept the wallet-grabbing tactics to a minimum. There's a store tab that's slightly tucked away, which leads to an admittedly flashy animation of a psychic saleswoman making tarot cards dance through the air, but they don't currently make it feel like the microtransactions are being shoved down your throat. But the cosmetics that are here are severely overpriced. I will make fun of anyone that spends $8 on a horse saddle, $15 on a horse, or almost $30 on a set of class-specific armor cosmetics. Nobody cares about your horse besides you, and the armor is so inflated that it might as well be a hot air balloon. There's also the seasonal content, which is set to begin very soon, which seems fairly priced and customer friendly. You're not actually paying for access to the content, only for a $10 cosmetic track that progresses as you level up your character. The whole needing to start a new character to unlock seasonal rewards thing really sucks though. And please, understand that this is a separate conversation from you have to start a new character to participate in the new seasonal activities. I do not have the time nor energy to dive down that rabbit hole. I don't want to end this video on a sour note, so here's what I think about the whole package. Leveling up in Diablo 4 and running through the story is a really fun, rewarding experience, especially with friends. Once you hit the end of the campaign and begin the endgame, you'll still have plenty of captivating avenues to tread. But if you commit fully to hitting max level, getting the best gear, and making the most of your character, you had better be prepared for the grind. Diablo 4 receives an 8.5 out of 10.